we will hear a presentation from Jane Harms. She's with the Yukon Animal Health Unit, and she's going to give us information about MOVI surveillance in Yukon wildlife.
Hi, Margot. Thanks very much. This is Jane. Can you just let me know if you can hear me and if you can see my slides?
Yes, you're all set and ready to go.
Great. Thanks very much for that introduction, Margot. And so I'll be talking a bit about our surveillance for MOV in Yukon wildlife, not just specific to sheep and goats at this point. It's great to have a chance to present this information. I appreciate this opportunity, and it's been really great to hear some of the work that's being done in the other jurisdictions as well, for sure. So before I start, I just wanted to acknowledge some of the many collaborators that work with me on this project. Certainly my Yukon government colleagues, Dr. Kristen Magnuson, who you'll be hearing from later today, Michelle Thompson, Mary Vanderkop, Megan Larive, and Maud Henoff, as well as a wide range and number of biologists and technicians in the Department of Environment that have worked with us to collect samples for this work. Also acknowledge the Yukon outfitters and hunters that have participated and have made a lot of efforts to make this work happen. Certainly would like to acknowledge and thank my colleagues in other jurisdictions, particularly Helen, Perry, Tom, and Kimberly. All of them have been always available at the end of the phone or an email to provide advice and information, and I'm really grateful for the openness of those folks for sure. And also like to just recognize that the Animal Health Center Laboratory in Abbotsford, BC has been an important collaborator on this work. And then the funding for this project so far has been coming from Yukon government, but also importantly from the Yukon Wild Sheep Foundation for some of the testing. So pathogen or disease surveillance in Yukon wildlife to date, I think it's fair to say that most of our surveillance is focused on pathogens that are of concern for wildlife population health and also for human health. But with increasing human populations and domestic animal populations in Yukon over the past, I'd say 30 to 40 years, the interface between domestic and wild animals and the potential for transmission of pathogens between those two groups has certainly increased in I would say, just obviousness to people like myself working in wildlife management, and of concern to people who care about wildlife health and domestic animal health. Certainly in that time, and probably most over the past decade, concerns over the health of our thin-horn sheep population, with particular respect to the possibility of pneumonia, similar to what's seen in bighorn sheep populations elsewhere. That concern has definitely been increasing. And of course, due to the work of many of the people here today, in particular Tom Besser, the concern has been mainly focused on the pathogen Mycoplasma ovipneumoniae, and that's been considered a pathogen of significant concern for us in Yukon. Obviously, most of you will know all of these details, and Tom gave an amazing presentation this morning, giving us a lot of information about MOV. But just a quick reminder that this is a bacteria that's carried in the nasal passages of domestic sheep and goats, and predominantly, and certainly what we've seen in Yukon, these are healthy looking animals, although this pathogen can certainly result in respiratory illness or other symptoms in domestic animals. But it is, of course, strongly associated and is a key pathogen associated with pneumonia in bighorn sheep. And as Tom already outlined, there's many different strains of MOV, but not all necessarily are virulent or cause disease. There's also different strains of MOV that are found in sheep and goats, but what has been found is that both of these, or excuse me, strains from either of these species can be passed on to bighorn sheep for sure, and can result in disease. So for our Dall sheep population in Yukon, currently we have about half of the North American population of thin-horn sheep in our territory. So that's about 20,000 animals approximately. As you can see from the map on this slide, the green areas indicate the distribution or areas where we know there's thin-horn sheep present. And I think, as Doug already mentioned and showed a great slide about the challenges of actually gathering accurate population data for a species like this, given the massive areas that they live in and the challenges of the terrain, those logistical and expense challenges make it difficult to really get a good hold on the specific numbers in different populations in different areas. We do also have additional data from harvest monitoring, and that seems to correspond pretty well with our current knowledge of distribution of thin-horn sheep in the territory. And we did initiate a capture project where we were going to put about 45 collars on a number of groups of thin-horn sheep throughout the territory in 2019. Unfortunately, that was put on hold due to some weather issues and the fact that we are currently lacking a sheep biologist in the Yukon government, but we're hoping to put that project back on the docket for the coming years, and hopefully that'll give us some additional information as well. Currently in Yukon, there have been no pneumonia outbreaks that have been documented or reported in any of our wild thin-horn sheep populations, but we do know that MOV can cause pneumonia in captive thin-horn sheep, and that's been reported in the 80s. So as a result of this information, learning what's happening in other jurisdictions with bighorn sheep, and the concern that was really increasing about thin-horn sheep health in Yukon, we started testing nasal swabs from Dall sheep in 2015. And Tom's already also alluded to the findings in Alaska around MOV in wildlife. And with the detection of MOV in caribou, Dall sheep, mountain goats, and moose in Alaska in 2018, we also started some testing for MOV in those species in Yukon in that year as well. So the goals of our surveillance are to detect spillover of pathogens from domestic animals into wildlife. And specifically, we're interested to know if MOV is spilling over from domestic sheep and goats in Yukon into any wildlife species, but certainly particularly in thin-horn sheep and mountain goats. We're also interested, in light of the Alaskan findings, to see if we have also wildlife-specific MOV strains in any of our wildlife, thin-horn sheep and other. And so that's those findings in Alaska, and that sort of confusion and contradiction, as Tom mentioned already, is also definitely driving our surveillance efforts in Yukon. So we've been collecting nasal swabs from live or dead animals, as many other folks have already alluded to, using polyester swabs. Some of these have been collected by sheep hunters and by outfitters, but most of the swabs and samples have been collected from Yukon government staff from either biological submissions or from live animals during captures. All of our samples to date have been tested by the MOV-specific real-time PCR that looks for a segment of the 16S rRNA gene, and that's the protocol that's been published by Tom's group and others, and I believe the PCR is very similar to the MOV-specific one that's used at Waddell. But ours have all been tested by the, as I mentioned, Animal Health Center lab in Abbotsford. And again, I'd just like to acknowledge the Yukon Wild Sheep Foundation has been instrumental in covering the testing costs for our wildlife surveillance in the last couple of years. And they've also been supportive for our hunter collected samples as well in those years. So just moving on to some of our results here, the map that you can see shows the game management subzones in Yukon where we have collected at least one sample for MOV surveillance. And so it's interesting, the distribution of these sample collections matches quite closely the distribution of thin-horn sheep in the map that I presented a couple slides ago. So we're getting relatively good distribution of samples throughout the territory where we know wild sheep are and where they are harvested. You can see in the graph, I've just showed number of samples collected by year, and we certainly have increased our surveillance to date. We're currently hovering right around 100 samples a year that are being submitted for MOV testing. Just a note that we are, our harvest for Dall sheep is approximately around 230 sheep per year. So we're right around half of that are being tested. And certainly we have interest in increasing those number of samples for sure. I thought it would just be interesting to just note that we are also, as Mark kind of mentioned, doing what would be more passive surveillance or any clinical cases that I do a necropsy on. We're also obviously testing those for MOV as well as looking for other causes of illness or death. I thought it would just be interesting to throw up a little chart there with a couple of the other findings that we do see in the sheep that I've been necropsying, a bit of a range of lesions and illnesses. We do see a number of verminous pneumonia cases, and we've had kind of a scattering of a few other things, but nothing very consistent. And all of these found dead sheep have also been MOV negative, and these represent a mix of rams, ewes, and lambs, which we don't see in the harvested population. Those are just rams. A note on hunter collected samples. So you can see here that over the years, the number of samples collected by hunters have also increased. So we're around kind of 20, 25 samples these last couple of years. The interest from sheep hunters in Yukon to help with this work has been massive. And unfortunately, I didn't get the actual number, but I do know that in the past couple of years, we've been giving out hundreds of kits a year. So it's always a little bit interesting to me to see that we're giving out hundreds of kits and only having about 25 actual samples come back to us. So one of the things I'd like to do this year is work a little bit on why we have a relatively low return and what are some of the things that we could do to improve the return from the hunter collected samples as well. In this slide, I just provide the samples that we've collected from caribou. A number of different caribou herds have been sampled since 2018. And so the map with the red arrows and the green blobs is showing you the approximate distribution of the different herds we've sampled. So the 4 different mountain caribou herds that we've sampled are Clear Creek, Ibex, Heart River, and Carcross. So we've got a few from southern Yukon and a few from central to northern Yukon. And we're certainly planning to increase surveillance in a number of different herds, but our caribou surveillance is very much tied to which herds are being captured for radio collars. So we'll have a few more for this year, more in sort of the eastern part of the territory. And again, that surveillance is going to certainly continue on. So you can see that we've certainly increased our number of samples collected in 2019 and 2020, and hopefully that number will continue to increase. The porcupine caribou herd, which is a transboundary herd we share with Alaska and NWT, is in the far north of the territory. So far, that's been our highest number of samples collected from that herd. And then, unfortunately, significantly fewer samples have been collected from the 40-mile herd, which is a little bit south of the porcupine herd there. Those 2 herds are in yellow because those are barren ground caribou. And again, 40-mile herd is a transboundary herd that we share with Alaska, and I will just mention that again in a few slides. And finally, this graph is showing the other wildlife species that we've also had a chance to test for MOV. So that includes mountain goats, elk, moose, mule deer, muskox, and bison. The muskox and bison samples have all come from captured animals. And so this graph unfortunately is missing. There's a few other samples that we still have yet to test and to report on, but so far of the small number we've tested, those have all been negative. And then the other 4 species are all from harvest samples. And so we kind of have a varying range of those, again, depending on the number of harvested heads that come in that we can actually sample. So just to wrap up and summarize what we found to date, I would say we certainly haven't tested enough animals of most species to draw any significant conclusions. And we do want to continue to sample as many caribou herds as possible. Again, the results from Alaska are, I think, quite important. And because we're neighbors with that jurisdiction, certainly weigh quite heavily on some of the work that we're doing in Yukon. With regard to Dall sheep and mountain goats, so far all of these samples have been negative, but we do want to continue to increase surveillance in these species And as I mentioned, once we get our capture program up and running, we will be testing live animals and would like to try and encourage more hunter-collected samples as well. And then, as been mentioned by a couple other presenters, we've really focused our surveillance so far on MOV, but in the interests of better understanding what's happening with the health of Dall sheep, we'd like to move to testing for additional respiratory pathogens in these animals as well. So far, we've had negative results for all of the other species, but I do want to mention that 40-mile caribou, again, are a transboundary herd, and there's been quite a number of positive detections on the Alaska side, and some of these animals are quite close to Yukon, so it would be quite reasonable to expect that probably there's positive animals that do move onto the Yukon side, so it's a bit of an artificial designation to say that herd is negative on the Yukon side. That's highly unlikely. And unfortunately, Kimberly's not here, but some of the information that's available publicly on 40-mile caribou from Alaska, they've tested about 250 animals so far with about 27 positive animals. So that's roughly the number of positives that they've been seeing so far in that area, in that herd. And for the last few minutes of my presentation, I just wanted to start to talk a little bit about some of the mitigation measures and the risk management techniques that we've been doing in Yukon. I think most folks here that are involved in any way in disease in wild sheep are probably aware that Yukon has done something a little bit different than other jurisdictions. And so I did want to mention that a little bit for completeness sake. So domestic sheep and goats certainly have been present in Yukon probably since the gold rush days. I found some interesting photos of Angora goats being used to pull sleds over the Chilkoot Pass. It's pretty unlikely they actually ever made it to Yukon, having climbed through that particular hiking trail. But you know, certainly we do know that those small ruminants have been in Yukon for at least 120 years in some way, shape, or form. And certainly it's fair to say that to this day, many farmers in Yukon definitely see value in raising these species in Yukon. They're much more adapted to the climate we have up here than, for example, cattle. And so I think sheep and goats will continue to be something that people have interest in raising in Yukon. We now know quite a bit about these two species throughout the territory. Actually, we know that the majority of them are raised in and around Dawson City and Whitehorse, and we know that we have about 400 animals total, so about 200 sheep and 200 goats. So for those of you that are in other jurisdictions with larger farms, that's obviously a very small number of animals. But it is a growing industry, and so folks are raising these species for milk and cheese, meat, wool, lawnmowers, and we've met a number of couch goats, which I never thought I would actually meet. And so certainly just the companionship of these animals is certainly important to folks up here as well. So what's been happening in Yukon is that a control order has been imposed on the owners of domestic sheep and goats. A control order is a temporary legal tool that allows us to respond to a hazard that might pose a specific threat to people, animals, or environment. And so this control order is created under the Animal Health Act, which is a little bit different than some other jurisdictions where it's issued jointly by the Ministers of Environment and Energy, Mines, and Resources. The goal of this control order is to prevent transmission of respiratory pathogens from domestic animals to wildlife, and most specifically from domestic sheep and goats to wild sheep and goats. And the control order came into actual effect at the beginning of this year, and it's in place now for 5 years. This control order sets out conditions for the owners of sheep and goats, and if people choose to keep these species in Yukon, they must abide by a number of different conditions. So these include just broadly pathogen testing and permanent animal identification, specific standards around containment fencing, and then permits that are required to introduce any new animals from outside Yukon. We have quite a bit of flexibility actually in implementing these conditions, and we purposefully built that into the control order, knowing that really we were going to have to manage this on a case-by-case basis, and that certainly turned out to be true. But what we aim to do on every single farm that we're working on is to follow the principles of reducing potential for close contact between wild and domestic animals. And if there is contact, having increased health of the domestic species to reduce the risk of passing pathogens onto the wild species. So, certainly a lot of folks are interested to know if it's working. It's a little bit difficult in a way to say for sure, because again, we haven't had outbreaks in wild sheep to date. And so we can't use that as a metric to tell if this is working. But what I think we are achieving is a balance of protecting wildlife health and supporting livestock owners. The vast majority of sheep and goats in the territory currently are fully contained under these fencing standards that I mentioned. And as one of the aspects of the control order, animals that are tested positive for MOV are required to be removed. The vast majority of those positive animals are destroyed. But as Helen mentioned, there are occasions where folks have chosen to remove the animals from the territory. And so, yeah, I think you'll hear a little bit more on that later. So we've had quite a bit of success with that. And one of the things that's been really excellent to see is that we've continued to have very good relationships with most of the sheep and goat owners, despite a lot of controversy and anxiety and stress around this particular order. The other thing to note is that we continue to see increasing numbers of sheep and goats being imported into the territory. We're aiming to do that mostly with pre-testing for MOV, and you'll hear more about this later. So I think it's fair to say right now that despite some of the fears from the industry, there's no evidence currently that the control order is quote unquote killing the sheep and goat industry in Yukon. And Dr. Magnuson will be talking in the next session following lunch, and will be providing much more detail on the control order for all of us to learn. So thank you so much for your attention.
Okay, and thank you, Jane. That certainly gives us a wonderful view into this issue from the Yukon perspective. It also has given me a new term that no doubt will lodge in my mind. I've never heard of a couch goat before, but certainly conjures up images. We'll move on.